Main text of Zhang Ailing's Half-Life Chapter 13. Xiaotong's coffin was transported back to Nanjing by water. Zhen followed the boat back, and Mrs. Zhen and his concubine went back by train respectively. Mrs. Zhen's mood has improved a lot since her husband died. She was very accustomed to the life of a widow. In the past, she was a widow because her husband was occupied by someone else, so she always had this feeling in her heart that she couldn't swallow. Unlike now, she was officially a widow, and her husband could almost be said to have died in the arms. After all, no one can take him away now. This made her feel very stable and comfortable. Because the space at home was small, the coffin was stored in the temple and funerals were held as usual. After being busy with these things, I was busy with the separation of the family. It was the concubine who made the request to separate the family. There were many children on the concubine's side, and the education expenses in her budget were extremely large. There was also her mother. She said that Xiaotong had promised to provide for her mother until she died. Although everyone knew that the personal savings she had accumulated over the years must be considerable. And when Xiaotong moved out of the small mansion while she was ill, she still had many important things that she had not brought with her. Unfortunately, this was all unproven. Zhen always tried to calm things down and advised her mother to let it go. But women were always short-tempered, and his sister-in-law was also involved. Their separation this time was for the concubine. His sister-in-law would still live with her mother-in-law, but they would always have to separate in the future. His sister-in-law felt that if she didn't plan for herself, she had to plan for Xiaojian. She had many complaints behind her. She blamed Zhen for being too weak. She also complained about his young master's temper and his ignorance of the difficulties of farming. She also suspected that when he lived in a small mansion in the past, he was very complimented by his concubine. The young man had no independent opinions, so he was biased towards she. In fact, Zhen is in a very difficult position. After procrastinating for a long time, the matter was finally settled. After the death of his father, after the 100th anniversary, Zhen went to his relatives' homes, as usual, to thank his filial piety and visited them from house to house. Shu Cuizhi also paid a visit to his house. Cuizhi's home is an old-fashioned 5-bay bungalow that is half central and half western. The garden in front is also half central and half western. With a wide lawn and a rockery in the middle of the lawn, a small pond was dug and raised. Goldfish. Zhen came this time on a summer evening. The sun had set, but the cicadas on the trees had not yet stopped. Cuizhi was walking her dog in the garden. She led the dog, but actually the dog led the person. He pulled the leash straight and pulled her away. Zhen nodded to her, and she called out the dog's English name, Lily. Lily. It was easy to get the dog to stop. Zhen smiled and said, "Isn't this dog young?" "I remember there was always a black dog like this," Cuizhi said. "You are talking about its grandmother. This one is from the same litter as the one in your family," Zhen said. "Called Lily?" Cuizhi said, "Mom originally called it Lai Fu, but I found it unpleasant." Zhen smiled and said, "Auntie is at home." Cuizhi said, "Going out to play cards." Cuizhi also came when they held the funeral, but at that time Zhen was a filial son and always stayed in the filial curtain and did not talk to her. Therefore, when they met this time, she couldn't help but ask him about his father's life before his death. Situation. When she heard that Zhen had been attending the hospital, she asked, "Did you stay at Shu Hui's house this time?" "Did you see him?" Zhen said. "He came to the hospital twice." Cuizhi said no more words. She had originally thought that Shu Hui might not be in Shanghai anymore. She once wrote him a letter, mentioning the termination of her engagement with Yipeng, but he never replied. He had been avoiding getting close to her. She also guessed that it was because her family was rich and he felt that he could not reach high places, so she always thought that she should take the initiative. But this time she wrote to him and he didn't reply. And she regretted it again. Not that it was too disrespectful of her behavior, because she had never thought of such things towards him. She regretted it not for anything else, but because she was afraid that people would think she was too explicit. Even if he was interested in her, he would instinctively feel disgusted. So she has always been depressed. She smiled and said to Zhen, "You often see Miss Gu in Shanghai, right? How is she?" Shijin said. I didn't see her this time, Cuizhi said with a smile. She and Shu Hui are very good, right? Shijin was a little surprised when he heard what she said. However, he immediately understood that she must have heard it from his sister-in-law. Didn't he tell his family that Manzan and Shu Hui visited Nanjing that time? He is Shu Hui's friend, lest they look at Manzan in a special way. Now that I think about the scene at that time, it seems that it has been many years, and it is very unclear. He forced a smile and said, she and Shu Hui are also ordinary friends. Cuizhi said, I really envy people like her. How good they are at doing things outside. Shijin couldn't help but smile bitterly, remembering that Manzan had multiple jobs. Despite working so hard all day long, some people actually envied her, but that is a thing of the past. Now that she is the wife of the hospital director, her life is of course more stable. Cuizhi said again, I also want to go to Shanghai to find something to do. Shijin said with a smile. What do you want to do? Cuizhi said with a smile. What? You think I can't do it? Shijin said with a smile. No. Aren't you studying in college now? Cuizhi said, graduating from college or not doesn't matter. Even if I wait until I graduate and say I want to go out to work, my family will still object. Then, she took a long breath. She seemed to have a lot of complaints that she had nothing to say about. Shijin couldn't help but look at her face. She has lost a lot of weight recently. Shijin felt that since she got engaged and broke the contract, she seems to be a little different from before, at least much calmer than before. The two of them followed the dog and walked slowly on the lawn. Cuizhi suddenly said, he is so lively. Shijin said, you mean Lai Li? Cuizhi paused for a moment and said, no, I said Shu Hui. Shijin said, yes, he is so lively. If I talk to him when I feel unhappy, I will really feel better. He thought to himself that after all, he and Cuizhi had nothing to talk about, and they would talk about it again. Shu Hui came. Cuizhi asked him to go in and sit for a while. He said he had two other families to visit, so he said goodbye and left. He has not been to relatives' houses these days. Now that it has been 100 days, these taboos no longer exist, and gradually there are many unavoidable social interactions. Once upon a time, his sister-in-law had a hitch in the matchmaking between him and Cuizhi. His sister-in-law felt very sorry for her cousin. If the shoes are not made, they will fall into disgrace. Of course, they didn't mention it afterward, and Cuizhi's mother was of course even more secretive about it, so none of their relatives knew the inside story about it. When Amy talks about this incident, she always blames Shijin's shyness and Cuizhi's stubborn temper. Otherwise, the two of them would be a good couple. Cuizhi was once engaged and then regretted the engagement, and now she has become a problem person again. Shijin may be overthinking. He thinks that when someone invites guests, he must be there for her. Cuizhi feels the same way. She often goes to Amy's place to play tennis, and Amy often seeks out Shijin to play tennis. There Shijin met Miss Ding, who was very good at tennis. She went to university in Shanghai and was classmates with Shijin. When Shijin went home, he mentioned her several times while talking. So his mother made an excuse to go to Amy's place and secretly took a look at Miss Ding. Before his death, Shijin's father once said that his only regret was that he did not see Shijin get married. Her mother did not dare to take up the matter at that time, because she thought that if Shijin got married, he would definitely marry Manzan. But now that much time has passed, Mrs. Shen thinks that the crisis has passed, so she often brings up her father's last words and talks about them. Almost all the young people I met were married, and it seemed that there were a lot of people getting married that year. Since autumn, I have been having wedding wines from other people one after another. The most irritating thing here is Cuizhi's mother. Originally, Cuizhi was not too old, and her mother didn't need to be so anxious. However, Cuizhi recently wanted to run away privately and left a letter behind, said she was going to Shanghai to find work. Fortunately, her family found out early and intercepted her at the train station. Although she didn't see anyone with her at the train station, her mother still believed that she must have been tempted. So since this incident, her mother has become even more eager to marry her off, thinking that leaving her at home will sooner or later lead to trouble. Recently, someone acted as a matchmaker for her and said that a kin family member was the young master of a rich man. Others said that he had a hobby. The introducer invited a guest, but Cuizhi refused to go no matter what. She hid out early in the morning without thinking about where to go. She felt that only her cousin could understand her current situation, so she wanted to go find her cousin and cry out. The eldest mistress of the Shen family and Cuizhi have always been close friends. Even when Cuizhi and Yupeng terminated their contract, one was her cousin and the other was her own brother. She did not favor anyone, because in her simple mind, everyone in her Natal family is good. Of course, her brother is a first-class good person, and her cousin is not wrong either. There must be an outsider causing trouble in this matter. Yupeng married Du Wengshan immediately after the contract was terminated. It must be that Du Wengshan was not good and deliberately tried to destroy their relationship and snatched Yupeng away. Therefore, she sympathized with Cuizhi. On this day, Cuizhi came to Shen's house and wanted to complain to her cousin. Unexpectedly, the eldest mistress, who never went out, happened to go out because her father-in-law was buried in the temple. Her mother-in-law remembered that she had not gone to see it for a long time, so I bought the incense paper money and went to Kaodao. I took Xiaojian with me, leaving Shijin alone at home. When he saw Cuizhi, he smiled and said, "Oh, your family knew you were coming here. They called just now to ask." "Yes, I told them it wasn't here." Cuizhi knew that her mother must have become anxious and was looking for her everywhere. She sat down on her own and asked, "Cousin is out." Shijin said, "I went to the temple with my mother." Cuizhi said, "Oh, my aunt is not at home either." She saw something on the table. He was flipping through the book when Shijin saw her looking like she was ready to sit down for a while. He smiled and said, "Would you like to call your home and tell your family that you are here?" Cuizhi suddenly raised her head and said, "What are you doing?" Shijin was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, "No, I thought my aunt might have something to do with you." She lowered her head to read again and said, "She won't have anything to do." Listening to her tone, Shijin understood a little bit. She must have run out in a fit of rage with her mother. Cuizhi has always been unhappy, and he has long seen it, but because he is also very sad in his heart, and he absolutely does not want people to ask about the reasons for his sadness. So he applies it to himself, and he does not want to know why others are sad. It's okay to say that they share the same problem. He feels that when he is with her, he is much more comfortable than in the company of others. At least he doesn't have to force a smile like that. The dog Cuizhi gave them came up timidly and wagging its tail. Cuizhi put down the book and scratched the dog. Shijin chatted with him and said with a smile, "It's quite pitiful that this dog ended up in our house. There is no garden, and no one takes it out for a walk." Cuizhi didn't hear what he said. Shijin suddenly saw her eyes filled with tears, and he fell silent. It was Cuizhi who broke the silence and asked, "Have you gone to play tennis in the past 2 days?" Shijin smiled and said, "No. Are you going today?" "Let's go together," Cuizhi said. I'll call there was no progress even after being beaten. Her voice was very calm when she spoke, exactly the same as usual, but as she spoke, tears began to fall. She turned away and wiped them impatiently, but she could never wipe them away. "Dry?" Shijin smiled and called out, "Cuizhi." Then he asked, "What's wrong with you?" She didn't agree. He stayed for a while longer, then came over and sat next to her, wrapping his arms round her shoulders. The new autumn wind blows in from the window, and the book on the table flips page by page, making a snapping sound. The sound is very clear and lovely. Cuizhi finally broke free from his arm. Then she whispered, as if to explain, "I'll let others see it later. Then, if there is no danger of being seen, it's okay." Shijin couldn't help looking at her and smiled. Cuizhi immediately blushed, stood up and left, saying, "I'm leaving." Shijin smiled and said, "Go home?" Cuizhi said loudly, "Who said that? I'm not going back." Shijin said with a smile, "Then where to go?" Cuizhi said with a smile, "Then don't worry about it." Shijin said with a smile, "Let's go play tennis." "Okay," Cuizhi said with a smile. At first he was non-committal, and then he went together. The next day he went to pick her up at her house again, intending to play tennis together. But he didn't go. He just sat and talked at her house and went back after dinner. Her mother was very affectionate to him and also became affectionate to Cuizhi after that. Zhen often went to their house every 3 days or 2. Mrs. Zhen and the eldest mistress were of course very happy when they found out, but they didn't dare to reveal it very much. They were afraid that if everyone coaxed him, he would back down again. Even though everyone said nothing on the surface, they created a peaceful atmosphere. Zhen was always surrounded by this peaceful atmosphere whether he was at home or going to Cuizhi's place. For Cuizhi's birthday, Zhen gave her a diamond brooch. The diamond was originally in his family. It was a pair of earrings from her mother. It's just a platinum tube, and the style is very simple and elegant. Cuizhi pinned it on her collar on the spot. Zhen stood behind her and watched her pin it on the mirror. She asked him, "How do you know when my birthday is?" Zhen smiled and said, "My sister-in-law told me mine." Cuizhi smiled and said, "Did you ask her, or she told you herself?" Zhen lied and said, "I asked her." He looked at her in the mirror, and her face looked faint today. He had some rouge on his face, still had long bangs on his forehead. His curly hair was tied up with a black velvet belt, and he was wearing a short-sleeved crimson corduroy robe. Zhen stroked her arms with both hands and said with a smile, "Why have you lost weight? Look how thin your arms are." Cuizhi just raised her face and struggled to buckle her pins, saying, "I'm probably Jia. After a summer, you have to lose weight." Zhen stroked her arm, maybe tentatively, and then he came up from behind and kissed her cheek. "Her powder is very fragrant." Cuizhi struggled and said, "Don't be like this. What does it mean? People have seen it." Zhen said, "When you see it, you see it. It doesn't matter now." Why it doesn't matter even if it is seen by others now? He did not explain, and Cuizhi didn't insist on him saying it. She just turned around and smiled shyly at him. The two of them have made an agreement. Zhen usually reads novels and always feels that the characters in the novels are always very troublesome whether they are married to a man or a woman. In fact, getting married is really not an easy thing. He found out now. Because Zhen's father had just died and he couldn't be too extravagant, so they didn't plan to do anything when they got engaged, scheduled to get married in October. When he and Cuizhi were alone, they often liked to talk about their future marriage. Cuizhi always hoped to go to Shanghai one day to start a small family. What kind of house to live in, what kind of furniture to buy, and what color to paint the walls. Everything is very specific. Unlike before when I was with Manzan, thinking about living together in the future, I just feel elated. In short, I am very happy, but I can't quite imagine what it will be like. There were a lot of things to buy before the wedding. Zhen planned to go to Shanghai. He said to Cuizhi, "I'm also going to visit Shu Hui and ask him to be the best man. He can also help with many other things." Don't look at him laughing and joking like that. He is really capable of doing things. I really admire him. Cuizhi didn't say anything at first. After a while, she suddenly said angrily, "I don't understand why, when you mention Uncle Hui always talks good about him. As if you are inferior to him in everything. But in fact you are much better than him. You are 10,000 times better than him." She hugged him and buried her face in his shoulder. Zhen had never seen her express such enthusiasm before, and he was a little flattered. At the same time, he felt ashamed because she was so innocently enthusiastic towards him. And he was probably still a little uneasy in his heart even now. It was for this reason that he was eager to talk to Shu Hui face to face and discuss it with him. When he came to Shanghai, he knew that Shu Hui would not come home until Sunday, so he went directly to their dormitory in Yangshupu to find him. Shu Hui had already got off work, and Zhen noticed that he was wearing a gray woolen vest. It was the same two pieces that Manzan had given to the two of them. Zhen had not worn that one for a long time, but he couldn't. No one else is allowed to wear it. The two were walking in the countryside. Shu Hui said, "It's a coincidence that you came. I was just about to write you a letter. I got a scholarship and went to the United States to be a poor student. I really made my life back. I couldn't help it. See if nothing can be done here. It might be better to get a doctorate and come back." Zhen asked hurriedly, "Where in the United States?" Shu Hui said, "It's a small university in the northwest of their country, little known. Guan, as for him, after getting a doctorate, we can also be bosses. If you are interested, I will find connections for you when I get there, and you can go too. Zhen said with a smile, I might not want to go, but my situation is not the same. It's too simple? Shu Hui smiled and said, listening to your tone, you are getting married, right? Zhen knew as soon as he heard this that he had misunderstood and thought it was Manzan. He was really embarrassed, so he could only smile and said, I came to discuss this matter with you. Cuizhi and I are engaged, Shu Hui said in astonishment. Cuizhi. He suddenly laughed strangely, and then said, what are you discussing with me? His tone was simply hostility may not necessarily be due to injustice, but seems to contain an insult. Zhen felt really irritated. Under such circumstances, of course he would never admit that he was also doubtful, so he said, I want you to be the best man. Shu Hui was silent for a while, then said, marry Cuizhi, then you are completely stuck, and have no choice but to live your whole life, and be the husband of a rich young lady. Zhen only smiled faintly and said, that's up to everyone. He was obviously not very happy. Shu Hui also felt it, and he blamed himself again. Why was he so opposed to their union? Is he still a little selfish? Regarding Cuizhi, on the one hand, he rationally does not allow himself to get close to her, but he does not want others to possess her. That's despicable. When he thought about it, he originally had many words to persuade Zhen, so he didn't plan to say them. He laughed and said, look how unreasonable I am. I haven't even congratulated you yet. I'm just trying to argue with you. Zhen also laughed. Shu Hui smiled again and asked, when did you get engaged? Zhen said, just recently. He felt that he needed some explanation, because he had never had a good impression of Cuizhi, and Shu Hui knew better than anyone else. He said, you remember, my sister-in-law also introduced us in the past, but she was still a child at that time. As for me, I probably had a childish temper at that time. The more I was asked to introduce, the less I felt comfortable with it. I am willing. His tone seemed to mean that the old era of willful youth had passed, and now he was steadily entering middle age, and was embarking on the journey of life in accordance with the lifestyle that people of the same class were accustomed to. When Shu Hui heard what he said, he felt desolate. They were walking slowly in the wild. It was already dusk, and a group of croaking crows flew overhead. Zhen asked him to be the best man again, but Shu Hui declined, saying that he was leaving soon and might not be able to attend Zhen's wedding. But Zhen said that if it was too late, he would rather move the wedding date earlier, and Cuizhi would definitely agree. Seeing his persistence, Shu Hui couldn't refuse. That night, Shu Hui stayed with him to have dinner in the dormitory. After the meal, he talked for a while before leaving. This time he came to stay at his uncle's house. After staying for a few days, I bought almost everything and went back to Nanjing. Shu Hui came to Nanjing the day before their wedding. The family is always noisy when holding wedding events, and the house is turned upside down and the house is in chaos. Mrs. Shen even arranged a guest room for Shu Hui even in her busy schedule. The place in their own home is a little cramped, but the wedding ceremony this time was quite grand. The wedding was held at the Central Hotel first, and the wedding banquet was held at a large restaurant in the evening. When Cuizhi appeared in the restaurant, she had already changed into casual clothes. A bright red velvet narrow-sleeved cheongsam was covered with a bright red velvet waistcoat, which was the most popular style at that time. Shu Hui looked at her from a distance under the lamp. They hadn't seen her for a long time, almost a year. The last time they met, he congratulated her because she and Yu Peng were engaged, but now he congratulated her again. As an outsider forever, he can't help but feel a little emotional. He was the best man and should sit at the same table as the bride and groom. However, because he was good at socializing and they wanted to use him to entertain the guests, he was placed at another table. Perhaps because of his presence, their table was particularly lively, and the drinking and commotion was fierce. Shu Hui's boxing skills were really not very good, and he refused to admit defeat. As a result, he drank the most. Later, everyone took turns going to the newlyweds table to toast. and Shu Hui also started making noises, and everyone clamored for them to report their love story. After a long stalemate, someone else came out to smooth things over and asked them to help each other in public. This may be a problem for the old-style bride and groom. Like their new-style marriage, which is based on love, shaking hands doesn't matter. However, Cuizhi's temper was very stiff. She just sat there with her head lowered, and Zhen with a tender face. Shu Hui was still there to help them out. He pulled Cuizhi's hand and said with a smile, "Come on, come on. Zhen, hold out your hand. Hurry up." But Cuizhi suddenly raised her head at this time, looked at Shu Hui blankly. Shu Hui must be drunk, because for some reason he held her hand and wouldn't let go. Zhen thought to himself that Cuizhi must be angry. The color on her face was wrong. It was so pale, and she almost seemed like she was about to cry. After the party was over, some people still followed them back home to continue making trouble, but Shu Hui did not participate. He had already agreed with Zhen that he would take the overnight train back to Shanghai that day because he was about to leave abroad. There are still many things to take care of, so when he returned to Zhen's house, he only spoke to Mrs. Shen, then quietly took the box and hired a car and left. The people who made trouble didn't leave until very late. The room that was originally packed with people had all left, so it should have seemed much emptier. But on the contrary, for some reason it felt like the place had become smaller, and the roof was too low, making it almost suffocating. Zhen pretended to be relaxed and stretched. Cuizhi said, "There was a little fat guy who made the most noise just now. Who was that?" They brought out today's guests one by one and talked about them. A certain lady was the most eye-catching, a certain wife was the most crazy, and a certain lady was the most crazy. His behavior was the funniest. We talked for a long time and seemed to be very interested. There were several tall glass dishes on the table containing various candies. Zhen let her eat them like a master, and she ate some of each. This room was originally the living room of their family. After some modifications, Mrs. Shen catered to their young mentality and did not use bright red in everything like the old-style new house. The sky was as red as a sea of blood. Now this room is very elegantly decorated, more like a Western-style hotel room. But there was a pair of silver candlesticks on the table, lit with two red candles. Only the late-night red candles have some hint of a new house. Cuizhi said, "Shu Hui was really drunk today." Zhen smiled and said, "No, I'm really worried about how he got on the train alone." Cuizhi was silent, and after a while she said, "When he woke up, he didn't know where the train had gone." She sat in front of the dressing table and brushed her hair, which was covered with red and green confetti thrown by others. Zhen also told her about the old concubine from his uncle's house who had eaten fast and chanted Buddha's name. She hadn't left the house in 10 or 20 years, but she actually came to watch the ceremony today. Cuizhi brushed her hair and then remembered, "Have you seen the way Amy's hair looks today? It's very special." Zhen said, "Oh, I didn't pay attention." Cuizhi said, "It's said to be the latest hair in Shanghai." Like, did you see it last time you went to Shanghai? Zhen thought for a moment and said, "I don't know. I didn't pay attention." The conversation gradually became lacking in information, so Zhen smiled and said, "You must be tired today, right?" Cuizhi said, "I'm fine." Zhen said, "I'm not sleepy at all. I probably talked too much, but instead I'm reminded of God. I would like to sit for a while and read a book." "You can go to bed first," Cuizhi said. "Okay." Zhen was reading an illustrated magazine there. Cuizhi continued to brush her hair. After brushing her hair, she took off her jewelry and put them in the dresser drawer. Seeing that she was taking her time, Zhen thought that she might find it inconvenient to undress and go to bed in front of others. So he smiled and said, "I'm afraid you can't sleep with the light on, right?" Cuizhi smiled and said, "Hey." Zhen said, "I also have this habit." He stood up and turned off the light. He turned on another lamp to read, and the room immediately became dark. After a while, he looked away and saw that she was still cutting her fingernails under the candlelight. It's really late, and one of the two candles has been lit first. According to superstition, this is a very bad omen. Although Cuizhi may not believe this, Zhen still kept his thoughts in mind and just smiled and said, "Hey, the candles have been lit. You still have not gone to sleep," Cuizhi answered after a while. "I'm going to sleep." Zhen heard that her voice was a little hoarse, so he thought that she might cry again because he had ignored her. Could it be because one candle was lit first? He looked at her carefully, but at this moment, she happened to use the same scissors she used to cut her nails to cut the candle flowers. As soon as she cut, the flame of the red candle dimmed, and her vision suddenly went dark. Well, the candlelight lit up again and shone on her face. Her expression was already very calm. But Zhen knew that she must have been crying just now. He walked up to her, smiled, and said, "Why are you unhappy again?" he asked again and again. She pushed him away in disgust at first, and then she suddenly grabbed his clothes and started sobbing. She blurted out, "Zhen, what should I do? You don't like me either. How many times have I thought about it? Well, if it wasn't for the fact that we had already made trouble once before, later people will say, why do we always break off the engagement? What will happen? It's too late now. Do you think it's too late?" Of course it was too late. What she said was exactly what he was thinking. He admired her for having the courage to say it, but what was the benefit of saying it? He could only murmur to comfort her, "Don't think like that. No matter what you do, I will always treat you anyway. Cuizhi, really, don't worry. You don't want to be like this. Don't cry. Hey, Shu Hui, see," he murmured comforting words in her ear, but in fact, he himself was as confused as she was. He felt like they were two children who had gotten into trouble.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.